How y'all doing? I hope you don't mind that I'm going to disrupt the flow a little bit. So I think that you guys have had a really wonderful day probably trying to say how you should do sustainable landscapes. But I'm going to try to challenge you to think differently about sustainable landscapes. So as an undergraduate ecology student, I was about as wide-eyed as they come. I loved learning and exploring all the ways ecological systems interacted and spent the latter half of my time there immersed in either the Gulf of Mexico or swamps in North Florida. And one thing I couldn't ever get past was the inability of my ecology professors to think about social systems and political systems and all these other things that I thought were really interesting about how they interacted with environments and ecologies and landscapes. So I insisted to my advisor that my women's studies and sociology classes and all these other classes I wanted to take were equally as important as the environmental ones. I spent one summer studying snook. Anyone know what snook are? It's a fish. And so that was undergrad, and I was trying to figure out if snook, bear with me while I tell this anecdote about fish. I was trying to figure out if snook coordinated their spawning based on the moon phases, right? And that would make sense because the way snook spawn is, the females release eggs into the water, and the males release sperm into the water, and they just really hope for the best. So it would make sense if they tried to time that, right? So I did this research, and I found that if I was near state parks, it was pretty consistent that they got together to do that near full moons, right? If I was close to a resort where there was a lot of light, there was no consistency in how they were spawning. So that was kind of my first really hard, concrete example of why this is so important to think about how ecology interacts with people. Political unrest and social injustice, especially in developing countries, is so often inextricably linked to ecological crisis. I saw this firsthand during my Peace Corps experience, and we see examples of this interconnection every day in the news. I should have asked how you click the thing. There we go. So, a September article from Time magazine stated that from 2006 to 2011, large swaths of Syria suffered an extreme drought that, according to climatologists, was exacerbated by climate change. The drought led to increased poverty and relocation to urban areas. That drought, in addition to its mismanagement by the Assad regime, contributed to the displacement of 2 million Syrians. So this led to this refugee crisis that we're having, and experts say that what happened in Syria is likely to happen in many other regions across the world in coming years. So this illustrates at a really big scale, at a global scale, why it's so vital to consider the interconnectedness between social, cultural, political, economic, and ecological systems. But this consideration is also very important to the work we do here in Austin as landscape professionals. In my current work as an urban ecological designer and planner, I try to be vigilant on each project I'm involved with to ensure myself and my coworkers are considering all the systems related to a project. I'm lucky to work at Asakura Robinson, my boss is right there. And that's because we work on planning urban design and landscape architecture work, but we really attempt to strengthen environments, positively impact communities through innovation, engagement, stewardship, and a really integrated design process. So we strive to promote the interdisciplinary thinking that drives socially and ecologically resilient work. Collaboration is really important to this process. My coworkers will have very different insight into the systems at play in each project. So our staff members shown here have different expertise. Each person brings a different thing to the table, as illustrated by all the different colors surrounding each person. Some colleagues will have more insight into how pedestrians and bicyclists will move across a site, and I will have a much deeper understanding of how water and wildlife flows into and out of a site. Most of us still experience the effects of a childhood education system that separates social science, and science, which continues to manifest in higher education when you have to pick a degree that only focuses on one thing. And then finally continues, if you work in government, based on the siloed nature of our departments, right? So I also have to say here too, we have this collaborative work environment in our office that's really effective at trying to think about all these different systems at play in our projects, but it's also really important that we continue to do engagement with communities who otherwise we wouldn't understand the systems at play that affect their lives. So we do a lot of public engagement in our planning work. So I plan to speak about 3 projects, and they all relate to landscape at various scales. But what I really want to focus on most is how these projects, a Gulf Coast restoration project, an Austin-based creek initiative, and a Green Alley project actually do one thing very well. They all consider various social or ecological systems and integrate those considerations into planning and design. My first case study is a project where I've been tasked to recommend strategies and designs to restore coastal marsh on the Gulf. The way I approached this project was heavily influenced by historic examples of transects. So does anyone know who Ian McHarg is? So he's kind of the father of ecological planning. And so his transect is on the top, and he kind of pioneered this concept of the transect, and he identifies all the ecological systems in a coastal dune system. So he looks at vegetative communities. He provides a section showing relative elevations. He identifies important variables throughout the system, such as sand movement, salt spray, soil salinity, all these things that we think about on a regular basis if we're in a coastal system. Pretty much anything that you would need to know through the lens of ecology, right? The second one, Patrick Geddes, also uses a transect, but he looks at what he calls the valley plan for civilization. So now he's looking through an economic lens at different jobs that you might see along this transect in a valley, in a rural area. Finally, Suwanee is someone who kind of brought the concept of new urbanism to the forefront, and there are a lot of manifestations of that in how we plan in Austin. And the bottom transect shows how from a rural to urban core, there's a gradient of urban form, right? This one I put in just because it's awesome. So these are part of a series called Oyster Texture, and they were part of the 2010 Rising Currents exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. So now we've moved beyond and are constantly influenced by those historic examples of transects, and people are now using these things to make these complex diagrams or illustrative drawings, and this was actually shown at the Museum of Modern Art. And this is a really great example of looking at all different systems interacting. They have illustrated industry, different land uses, the marine science side, so these are modeling oysters in this area, human interaction, hydrology, geology, all of these processes on site. So if I'm following McHarg's approach for my coastal restoration project, I would identify elevation first. Though there's not much elevation coastally along the Gulf, like the highest point in this transect is 5.8 feet, which is why the little guy is there for scale. And then I would also show ecosystem types across my project area. This transect has examples of freshwater, intermediate, brackish, and saline marsh, as well as open bay, oyster reef, and barrier island systems. And to establish the best understanding of the system ecologically, I would also probably include things like tides, salinity, vegetation composition, biodiversity of marine organisms. There are many things I could include in this to think about the ecology. But if I take it a step further, add to my transect sociocultural value, similarly to how Geddes added, an economic or social component in jobs, I can begin to think about the positive and negative interactions among these systems. Hopefully, in turn, providing a more thoughtful and resilient design strategy that takes into account any social barriers and plays into social values that are complementary to ecological ones. For instance, if I choose to suggest restoration at a certain point on this transect, my design strategies could focus on enhancing storm protection, tourism, and fisheries. Those are complementary effects of whatever my restoration strategy is. But more importantly, I can also be aware that some design intervention may conflict and negatively affect some of those sociocultural factors. So if I say I want more fresh water to be diverted in this point in the marsh, that's going to affect oyster fisheries, it's going to affect sediment, it's going to affect the vegetative composition in that area. It also goes without saying that I've included oil and gas industry on here in an unbiased way, but that pretty much always is going to conflict with ecological restoration, so it is important to understand where that's occurring so that I can plan for that in my design strategy. So this could get even more complicated. I could start adding politics to it, and that's the difficulty of what I'm asking you to do. It's already overwhelming at times to try to be cognizant of all the ecological components of a site, and as humans, we want to simplify things, not further complicate them, but I really believe that this holistic strategy that I'm asking you to start thinking about is just too important to ignore. My second case study focuses on creeks in Austin. When I started work on my thesis project in the Planning and Sustainable Design departments at UT Austin, I wanted to understand how people in Austin perceived creeks, which led me to the question, how do people value creeks? So it's probably obvious to you guys at this point how I value creeks. I visualize this gradient of a system, of systems, and this constant balance of ecological, social, cultural, economic, and historical values. You're going to get really tired of hearing that list of values. Sorry. At each point along a gradient from Austin city center, where we are, to our outskirts, there are so many systems at play that are providing varying levels of services to us. So this is evident in this transect that shows how land use and density changes over this gradient. Each photo shows a completely different aesthetic of creeks in Austin. And then, I know it's kind of hard to see, but the chart illustrates that there's this hypothetical balance between all of those values that I like to think about when it comes to creeks. Urban creeks, when managed well, increase property taxes, thereby bolstering economic development of the city. In some ways, they also promote more gentrification pressure when improved. I see creeks in the urban core not as areas void of nature, despite their lower levels of ecological functioning, but as opportunities to connect urbanites to ecological systems. We are lucky in Austin in that we did not even need to leave downtown to experience Waller Creek or Shoal Creek. For those of us who spend most of our time in the midst of Austin's downtown, they're a daily reminder of the larger systems that we're a part of. In the urban periphery, creeks provide various values. Creeks like this have often been managed for practicality, right? So, Boggy Creek, for instance, has, especially in the lower reaches, been managed for flood control. And so there are economic, health, and social values to that, right? So you see this photo of Boggy Creek that's lined with gabion walls. Despite their sometimes over-engineered nature, sometimes these creeks are one of the very few opportunities for children from low-income families to experience and explore nature. Just to give some perspective, if you want to get from downtown Austin to Bull Creek, which is, according to the city, one of our healthiest creeks ecologically, you can take a bus most of the way, but for the final 2 miles, Google tells you need to get a taxi. I don't know where you're going to get a taxi at that point, but that's what it says. From an ecological standpoint, creeks on the urban periphery are the first to begin really increasing in biodiversity, thereby increasing in ecological value somewhat. Suburban creeks, like the upper reaches of Walnut Creek, for instance, begin to have more ecological value as wildlife habitat and tend to have higher water quality. Suburban riparian areas perform important ecological services as buffer zones, as Starn talked about, and some of our other people have talked about. And And they also provide some of Austin's most iconic recreational opportunities. Rural creeks perhaps provide the most ecological value because their ecological function is most preserved. But because few people get to experience those creeks, the economic, social, cultural, and historical values are less. Can anyone tell me what these creeks are? Which creeks they are? I'll start with the upper left. That one should be easy. That's boggy. What about the bottom right? Maybe. Okay. What about the others? So, okay, this is kind of a trick question, actually, and I'm sorry I did that to you. These are all boggy or a tributary to boggy. And the reason why I wanted to do that is because I've talked about 4 different creeks in my transect here, the urban periphery, suburban, and rural, but we also have to remember that even within one creek system, we have so many different systems at play and so many different types of value that they're providing at different points. So, all right. So just actually, let me go back to that. When I was doing my thesis research, kind of an interesting story, I was interviewing someone who lived right on Boggy Creek, kind of where the bottom left photo is, in that area. And she said that her mother had lived there for 20 years and that her kids, who were under 10, played in the creek weekly, and it was a great resource for them. And then somehow it came up that her kids also played baseball at Parque Zaragoza, and they go to the community center all the time. And I said, oh, that's great. Yeah, right by Boggy Creek. And she had no idea until that moment that that was the same creek. So, no judgment, but that is why I'm doing this project that I'm about to talk about. So, before I get into that, I also wanted to know how managers thought about creeks, right? So at the Urban Riparian Symposium last February, it seems like a lot longer ago than that, I surveyed ecologists, watershed scientists, engineers, city staff, biologists, environmental educators to find out how they all valued creeks, or if they valued creeks beyond ecological value at all. Most respondents recognized the importance of integrating social and cultural issues into ecological management, but fewer actually implemented them into their work. In fact, many respondents saw creek users as a barrier to ecological functioning and resilience. Practitioners cited public engagement and education most often as the social components to their ecological projects. Perhaps this indicates that they recognize the connection between advocacy and outreach and increasing ecological resiliency. However, framing humans as problems does not allow any room for facilitating this kind of thinking that I'm trying to promote, where we have to talk about how ecological value and social value and economic value all interact within the context of our urban system here in Austin. So if we only value creeks for their ecological value, and according to my hypothetical, these are not based on numbers, but this is how we would see them. So, our most valuable creeks would be the ones that we have little to no interaction with. And I feel like we're missing the boat as a growing city if we don't do something to paint a clearer picture of how urban creeks, which are one of our primary natural features, are valued holistically and then shift management accordingly. I also knew on the other side of the coin, people in Austin are largely disconnected from the majority of creeks in Austin. This image shows just how extensive our creek system is here in Austin, and this only shows major creek lines. This doesn't show any tributaries. This entire thing would be covered with lines if I showed every tributary and creek in Austin. So raise your hand if you've been to Barton Pool, Barton Creek. Raise your hand if you know what the closest creek to your house is. Okay, so I think that you're a biased sample, because if I ask most people, And I'm glad, because that means that you are more connected to these systems than you should be because you're landscape professionals. But if we ask most people those same questions, I think the answers could be very different. And even I am guilty of driving over a creek or driving by a creek every day and not really acknowledging that I'm doing that, and not even knowing that, that place I've been driving by for the last year actually has a creek right behind it. So that's something that this project that I'm about to talk about is trying to remedy. So my Creek ATX came about because I'm passionate about reconnecting people with the environment around us and believe the project could become a resource to promote holistic creek management. So I hope this project would help us center our communities on creeks rather than hide them behind parking garages. And the vision was to create a website and app that better connected Austinites to each other and the environmental systems around them, and better inform management of creeks throughout the city. I wanted to provide one place to find social media posts about creeks, USGS flow rate data, watersheds ecology scores, maps, and results from creek user surveys. I also thought that by aggregating all of this information and by gathering more information from users of the site, about how they value creeks socially, culturally, economically, and ecologically, that information could provide managers and advocates of creeks the context necessary to integrate a more holistic approach to management. I knew there was precedent for this type of website. So has anyone seen this Find Your Park site? It's a National Park Service thing. And they recently released this, and basically what it is, you can still find all the same information about your park, but it also streams in any social media posts about that park. You can see what other people are saying about your park. And it's definitely aimed at trying to get younger generations more connected to the environment and our park systems. A similar concept is Cali Parks. California State Parks is doing pretty much the same thing, but just specific to California. And the thing is, I know this information is out there for Austin. So my favorite creek is Bull Creek, which, don't take offense if it's not your favorite, and your favorite's like, oh, Boggy, it's in my backyard. But Bull Creek is gorgeous, and that's where I go hiking. So, for instance, Bull Creek, Greenbelt Park, and people are posting all the time about what they think about the creek. Photos of what they're doing at the creek with their kids and their family. On Twitter, posting beautiful videos of crazy flooding, beautiful videos of waterfalls, and also commenting, and same with Instagram. So we have all this information and all of these people talking about creeks, but we're not using it, and we're not able to really tap into that as users or as managers. So the other thing is, when I want to use creeks, I know where to find information about how much water is flowing in the creek. I know if I'm going to be able to sit in it, swim in it, or drown in it. And I know most people don't know where this information is. And even if they do find the USGS streamflow data, I can't imagine that one of your 13-year-old daughters is going to look up what cubic feet per second is before she goes swimming. And honestly, I probably wouldn't either. Before I was an ecologist, I probably wouldn't either. So, it's also taking all this information that isn't really in a format that is consumable by the public, and putting it in a format that can connect people to these systems for practical reasons, but also hopefully for more stewardship. So my first step was to organize an advisory committee made up of stakeholders from city departments, environmental and tech nonprofits, and a private sponsor, Asakura Robinson, where I work. We held numerous meetings establishing goals and obstacles most prevalent in creek advocacy. And we came up with 3 themes that we thought were really important to what we were doing if we were going to gather. These were three things that we wanted to focus on. So we all agreed that the website would be a valuable resource for people in the community to better connect them to creeks. We also all agreed that we needed more equitable engagement. And that's even coming from, maybe I shouldn't say this is coming from organizations that are doing work in specific communities, but recognize that there are other communities that don't have anyone advocating for their creeks who live in that community. And then third, we needed an organization that was more of an overarching creek advocate. You know, we have a lot of organizations that are specific to one creek, and not anyone that can facilitate collaboration between all of those nonprofits and the city and the public. So, we wanted to do an engagement activity to try to see what people would really want out of this website idea, right? So I organized, for the rest of my summer last summer, organized this charrette and hack that we had this fall. And in that process, I found that hackathons are really wonderful, and the tech community is amazing, but they're really less useful for a product that can go live right afterward, and here's your website, than they are at, you know, getting people really excited and coming up with some really good ideas. So we combined a public engagement session and a more technical hackathon. So in the morning, we had a more traditional public engagement that included everyone who came to the hackathon. And then we broke into 3 teams. We facilitated collaboration between members of the general public and the tech community. And each team worked on a different creek and created a prototype by day's end. The Boggy Creek group focused their prototype on ensuring that the website would be user-friendly and also something that could be perpetuated by users. So how is this going to continue to be refreshed with new information based on what people are posting on social media or based on some type of interaction that people can have with the site? The Barton team wanted a web experience that encapsulated what it was like to travel down Barton Creek. So they coupled recreational activity suggestions with potential effects that those activities could have on the creek's ecology. So they actually had like an interactive thing where it was like you were kayaking down the creek and you'd stop at a bubble and it would say, you can do these things on Barton Creek, and here is the potential effect on the ecology. And finally, Shoal Creek came up with this awesome subway-style map that really aimed to help people understand how creeks interact with other systems in the city. So where are the road crossings? What are the neighborhoods like around here? And also, what is it like in the creek? So later this month, we hope to gain the partnership of a fiscal agent, and we'll begin applying for grant funding to help complete our goals of web development, equitable engagement, and efficient collaboration among advocates. If you're interested in becoming involved in the project or being part of our advisory committee, just let me know. So I'm going to finish up by talking about a small-scale project. And despite its limited physical range, a single alley, the Green Alley demonstration project I worked on in 2014 was heavily influenced by larger systems. Our initial site visit affirmed some of our assumptions. This alley between Lydia and Waller and 8th and 9th Streets was used for what alleys have been designed for, trash pickup. We were tasked over the course of a summer to engage with the community, plan what we wanted to do in this alley, and design what we wanted to implement, and actually implement it. I did a lot of digging. So as we began to look at the ecological and hydrological systems on site, we focused on 2 main themes. We noted that as a pilot project, if this could promote future green alley projects, a system of linear habitat corridors could be created in what is now a stark system of underutilized alleys. So we focused on providing habitat for insects, bees, and butterflies on our final designs, which involved these habitat boxes. And we also provided some fruit-producing and food-producing plants, so that this was also a resource for the community, and that's something that they wanted. And we also noted that our alley happened to fall on a high point between 2 creek sheds. And so in our final designs, we alluded to that, And so if water fell on the west side of the alley, it was going to Waller Creek, and if water fell on the east side of the alley, it was going to a small tributary and then into the Colorado. And so that made its way into our final design as well. Prior to engagement, all the planners on the team were quick to point out that this neighborhood was in major transition. Historically, the neighborhood was predominantly Hispanic or Latino, with a tight-knit community drawn even closer by the Our Lady of Guadalupe Catholic Church. So through extensive engagement, we found out that about half the houses had changed ownership in more recent years, and the community had begun to shift in identity. However, the Salas sisters, pictured in the top two left photos, remained and proved to be prominent influences of culture and historical value in our design process. Two sisters who had recently lost their third sister. They'd lived on the alley since they were born over 80 years ago. And because of their inspiration, we actually ended up naming the alley Callejon Tres Hermanas, or Three Sisters Alley, as a tribute to the sisters and the history and identity of their community. So by telling you about these three projects, I hope I've convinced you to at least think about the importance of integrating an interdisciplinary process into the work that you do in Austin as landscape professionals. And please feel free to contact me or talk to me after or ask questions right now. Thanks.